to Preparing Your Data for an Affirmative Action Plan, and today we're going to be talking about applicant flow. My name is Carla Irwin. I'm the president of Carla Irwin & Associates. I'm a full-service affirmative action consulting firm. So for federal contractors, I provide affirmative action plans, training, report help, along with audit support. So anything that has to do with your affirmative action plans, I can help you with. And with me as a co-presenter, Stephanie Thomas from Thomas Econometrics.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Stephanie Thomas, and Thomas Econometrics is a full-service quantitative consulting firm, and we specialize in quantitative solutions to workplace issues. We look at things like adverse impact, disparate treatment, employment discrimination, in any kind of selection and compensation decisions.
Okay. So today we're going to, this webinar series is about getting back to basics, and we've kind of been breaking down the components of an affirmative action plan. Today we're talking about applicant flow, and with all of the changes that the OFCCP is making to the scheduling letter, to your reporting, all of it comes back to your data and your report, and we want to kind of remind everybody and get everybody back to basics with this webinar series. And the next thing that we're going to do in this series is talk about compensation. So that's in 2 weeks on the 30th. You're going to see the last of this initial webinar series be about compensation. So if you haven't already signed up, that will also be a very good one.
So as Carla mentioned, we're going to talk about the back to basics about compensation on the 30th. And then we're planning a second part to this series that's going to focus on OFCCP scheduling letter preparedness. What that's really going to focus on is with the changes to the new scheduling letter, that's going to affect the kinds of data that you're going to be required to maintain and the kinds of data that you're going to be producing. So we're going to talk about that in the Series 2. We'll talk about each of those 6 areas that we've covered so far. And as soon as we have official dates for those, they'll be posted on our website. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to go through basically the same kinds of things we've talked about in the previous webinars. We're going to talk about the data requirements. We'll talk about missing data and its effects as it relates to applicant flow information. And we'll give you some of our suggestions on data scrubbing and validation and the kinds of things that we look for when we're reviewing data for applicant flow for affirmative action purposes.
Okay, so let's jump into required data for an affirmative action plan, for your applicant flow data. And I've said this on the other webinars, and it's just as important here with applicant flow. And for some reason, this is one of the areas where it gets summarized into kind of by affirmative action job group or by job title, and you don't really ever get that demographic information or that kind of person applicant level data, and that's really important for a number of reasons. One, yes, you want to run your statistics by affirmative action job group and job title, and you want to know what the impact is. But if you don't have that individual data behind it, it's really difficult to understand if you have a problem, where your problem is coming from. It's really difficult to understand and find problems with regard to, are your sources working? Are you having any issues with disposition codes, that kind of thing. So again, it's really important that we have that, in-person applicant level data. Let's go through the fields that would need to be populated in your Excel spreadsheet. So first is date of application. This is really important. You need to think about how you're going to get that on there, whether you're using an applicant tracking system. It's much easier. A lot of that, you get logged in just as your candidate is filling out their information. The system automatically generates that. If you're doing it manually, it really should be the date that they fill out the application, if that's their first initial information they're giving you, or if they send you a resume and you're getting it that way, finding some way to track the date that they have given you that resume or information. So date of application is very important. Requisition number, again, usually pretty simple when it comes to an applicant tracking system. When it comes to if you're doing it manually, just find a numbering system that works for you, because it's important to understand who the comparator applicants are by individual hire. So yes, you may aggregate up by job title or aggregate up by affirmative action job group, but again, to be able to kind of put together justifications by who was hired and who was chosen, it's really important to know that breakdown. Candidate name, number. Some applicant tracking systems provide you with a number. So that's good to have. If you're doing this manually, there's no need for a number. Candidate name, fine. The job title applied for, really important. A couple different things. One, if you're using an applicant tracking system, hopefully it's, they've applied for a certain job and your system is set up so that they have to apply for a certain job. Or if you're doing a search in your ATS, that you link them with a specific job. Now, if you're doing this manually and people are filling out applications, some things that I suggest are, instead of having people apply for any open job, that they really get specific and they have to apply for a job that's open at the time. Race, gender, ethnicity. Obviously, you need that. You do a self-identification form. It's voluntary, so if you have their race, gender, ethnicity, put that on the report. Last selection step and disposition code. Last selection step being how far they got in the process. Was their resume just reviewed? Did you phone screen them? Interviewed? Were they hired? Really knowing and understanding, what steps they took in the process. Especially important if you're doing testing of any kind, so you know who was tested and who wasn't. So you can run impact ratio analysis against that also. Disposition code being what was the reason why you hired them or why you didn't choose them. Especially important in identifying whether someone is an applicant or not. So again, if they didn't meet the basic qualifications due to whatever reason, education, experience, or if they were not best qualified due to education, experience, something like that. So again, really important to have that level of detail because it's important to be able to analyze each step in your process and be able to dig into in the event that you have problems. Source, again, a very important one for a couple of different reasons. It's always good to kind of see where you're getting the majority of your candidates and applicants, and then also what sources are giving you the candidates or applicants that are getting farther, the farthest in the process. Because it's good on an annual basis to review your sources, especially from a diversity perspective, including individuals with disabilities and veterans, to make sure that where you're spending your money from an advertising perspective is giving you the type of candidates that you need. And if it's not, evaluate that and restructure it. And location. So for those of you who have multiple locations, again, it's going to be important so you can get the right applicant with the right hire in the correct plan.
So there's some additional candidate information that you should keep along the way. And how you keep this and how you actually record it's going to depend on the kind of applicant tracking system you're using, whether you're using an electronic system, whether you're trying to do it by hand. I would strongly advise against doing it by hand. There's a lot of applicant tracking systems out there that are very cost effective and are geared toward smaller organizations. So if you are a smaller organization, don't think that you have to go with SAP or a giant applicant tracking system. There are alternatives. The kinds of things you want to keep in that applicant tracking system is employment history and years of prior relevant experience. Sometimes this information will come from the actual job application itself. Sometimes somebody will attach a resume to the job application. It's important to record that employment history, and it's particularly important to capture the years of prior relevant experience if you have prior experience requirements as part of the qualifications for that position. So that's really important to document. Educational history is also something you want to capture. Typically, this will be contained in the job application. It may be on the person's resume. It's a good idea to capture that educational history and just bring it along with all of that person's transactions so it's there when you need it. Skills, abilities, and qualifications. And there's two things here. Self-reported versus pre-employment testing. So a lot of times people will put on their resumes or their job applications special skills and qualifications that they have, proficient with Microsoft Office Suite, experienced in C++ programming, can drive a forklift, certified forklift operator. All those kinds of skills and abilities you want to put into your applicant tracking system. If you do any kind of pre-employment testing, if they have to take some sort of a qualification exam to be eligible for the position, you want to document, when the test was given, what the score was, whether or not they passed. All those things are really important in terms of justifying your decisions to hire or not hire somebody. So if you have particular skills, abilities, and qualifications for a position, you want to be sure that you capture that information. Availability is another thing that should be captured. And what I mean by availability, sometimes people indicate that they're only available to work on Monday, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays, or they're only available for first shift and they're not interested in working second or third shift, or that they're interested in working part-time only, less than 40 hours a week, etc. This information can be really, really useful if you choose not to hire somebody because of their availability. So, if they only can work 3 days a week and they only can work first shift, but the opening is for a second shift position that requires weekend work, then one of the rejection reasons would be conflict of availability. So it's important to document what the candidate says about their availability, when they can work, when they want to work, what shifts they're available for. Compensation expectations and compensation demands. Sometimes this is part of the application process and sometimes it's not. If you ask candidates about former salary history or what their compensation expectations are, you want to be sure that you capture that information. One of the disposition codes that I see frequently is compensation expectations out of line with salary midpoint. So if you are looking to hire somebody in a job that pays, for instance, $50,000 to $55,000 a year, and the candidate's demanding $100,000, that rejection reason may be compensation expectations out of line. And in order to justify that disposition code, you want to be sure that you document what the candidate said their compensation expectations were. And ultimately, all of these kinds of candidate information about the educational history, the qualifications, availability, compensation, all those things are going to feed back into your disposition codes. So if you have a disposition code that says rejected, not enough prior experience, you want to be able to have that documentation of that person's actual prior experience somewhere in your data. So you can go back and say, yes, we require 3 years. This person only had 1. That's why we rejected them. So all of this expanded candidate info is going to link back to the disposition codes for each of the individual candidates.
And and both of us have worked on many audits, and this is critical information for us to for your consultants, and it has been helpful for us in working with our clients to be able to justify what your business decisions have been. If this information isn't captured up front, it's really hard to recreate afterwards. So that's really something to think about in your process. If as we're talking about this, you're realizing, oh, we're not really catching all of this, I would start thinking about your process and see if there's a way for you to start capturing it, in the future.
There's also some required documentation that you need to keep as well. And again, we always say ideally it should be electronically maintained. A lot of this information can be maintained right in your applicant tracking system and can be indexed by requisition number. You want to keep copies of all job postings. So anytime you advertise a position or advertise a vacancy, you want to be sure that you keep a copy of that job posting somewhere so you know exactly what it said. It's also important to record somewhere where that posting was advertised. Was it listed on Monster? Did you list it on a veterans job board? Did you post it with the state employment agency? It's important to record where those openings were advertised, particularly in an ongoing basis, because a lot of those organizations like Monster and career boards and things, you may not have access to history. They may not be able to provide that history to you. So if you have to tell an investigator or an attorney, where these jobs were posted, and you don't have that information, it may not be possible to get it later on down the road. So it's important to do this on a continual basis. The other kind of documentation you want to keep is any kind of social media information that you get about your candidates. And social media and recruiting really is a subject in and of itself. And it's really beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today. But a lot of people are using social media information in their recruiting process. It's a valuable recruiting tool. I think that there's a lot of fear surrounding social media and recruiting that really doesn't need to be there. It's possible to use social media safely and effectively in your recruiting process. You just need to be aware of what kinds of information is acceptable to have and what kind of information is not acceptable to have. And like I said, that's really, what is or isn't acceptable is really beyond the scope. But if you're using social media in your recruiting process, you need to document what information you obtained on each of the job candidates. It's also important to keep documentation about your pre-employment screening results. And when we're talking about pre-employment screening results, if you have, integrity tests or if you have skill tests or any kind of qualification exam or testing that you're going to do on your candidates before they're hired or as part of the hiring process, you need to make sure that you have those results documented. And you also want to have copies of those metrics documented as well. It's really important if you're going to use a test as part of the pre-employment screening process that you have that test validated to make sure that the criteria are acceptable and that the test doesn't have an adverse impact. So you want to keep copies of the test, you want to keep copies of the validation that you've done on that test, and you want to keep individual results of each of those pre-employment screening tools. And finally, you want to keep very careful documentation on any background checks that you run and the results and what those background checks show. Part of the documentation here is you need to have signed consent forms for criminal background checks, credit history checks, and it's a good idea to get a signed consent form if you're going to use a social media search for your candidates. Again, it's really a legal issue, and I can't give you the legal perspective and the legal requirements on this, but it's very important that your candidates know and acknowledge and agree to criminal and credit history checks. And there's some legal requirements about what you have to disclose to those candidates depending on what those background checks reveal. So I suggest you contact your employment attorney about that, but it's very important to make sure that all of this background check stuff is documented. Consent forms, what the background check results reveal, and how you followed up with the candidate about that kind of information. Very, very important.
Okay, postings with state employment office. This is OFCCP, when they're auditing you, it's the first question that they ask. If you don't keep it up front, it's really hard to create after the fact. So, my suggestion is proof that you've sent it to the state employment office. There are different ways to do this. Some of you may have agreements with vendors that provide this for you, and you're able to get reports. If you've made any contact, either personal contact with them, either calls, or you've attended job fairs, or you have whatever contact that you've had with them, make sure and document that. Very important. OCCP is really looking into this. This is going to be a big part of when the VETS regulations are updated. They're really looking at your contact with the state employment office and sending your jobs there. Outreach efforts, including any written agreements. So if you are doing, if you with either Monster or Career Builder or another online tool, and you have purchased Convict Diversity Outreach, having documentation of that. If you have any written agreements with organizations, if you've attended any job fairs, these are all very important things to create and keep documentation on. So if you go to a job fair, pick up a flyer, keep the invoice. If you're attending some sort of a workshop, again, kind of try and keep documentation on this. Is, in the event that you are presenting information for a desk audit, you really want to have this information to kind of create the folder of this is all the great things that I've done, or these are things that your consultant will be asking you for to kind of create that folder of this is all the great things that we have done. So very important. Again, one of those things hard to recreate after the fact. Any agreement that you have with third-party recruiters or vendors, so if you are sending them messages that say, that you are an equal opportunity affirmative action employer, you would like diversity candidates, including veterans and individuals with disabilities, that's very important to keep that information. Next. And then really anything else. I mean, we've covered a lot of things, but again, it's really anything else that's relied upon in your recruiting or hiring process. A lot of these things, once they're created, they become an employment record, so they need to be kept. In addition, it's really good information to help either yourself or your consultant really work with the OFCCP to show the outreach that you've done, to prove that you follow the regulations, and to prove business justifications in the event that there are any issues. Okay, so now we're going to move on to what are some of the common things that we see missing when we get applicant flow data. So first is requisition number. I do, mostly when it is for my clients that do this manually, they don't have an applicant tracking system. I have to work with them and go back and say, okay, so for this hire, who were the comparator applicants? Again, kind of like I said in the beginning, this rec number is important to really identify who is the hire and who are the comparator applicants, because in the event of we need to justify it, we need to kind of have that level. So that's something that I see pretty commonly. Voluntarily disclosed demographic information, making sure that that's being pulled into a report, or in the event that you're doing it manually, that you've kept it separate, you kind of bring that information back and get it onto the report. So I do see that missing quite a bit, especially when I see that someone has gotten very far in the process and we don't have it. Typically, that the self-ID form is somewhere. Find it. Source. It's really important, like I've talked about before, in order to identify the success of your outreach efforts, and that's just going to continue to be important going forward to really evaluate your efforts for females, minorities, veterans, and individuals with disabilities to say, okay, I've had this source for the past 3 years. This source hasn't given me anybody that's made it to the interview stage. So then it's really time to analyze whether you want to keep going forward with that source so that you can really increase your diversity of your applicant pool. Last selection step, really, like I said, this is really just how far someone gets in the process. Resume reviewed, phone screen, interview. A lot of times will get disposition codes. Sometimes they're generic, and I don't get to understand how far they are in the process. And that's a question that's asked, quite often by the OFCCP. Was this person interviewed or not? Was there a test given or not? So I'm afraid to put that in. And then you kind of descriptive disposition codes. You want them to be detailed as to why they weren't chosen. Really, was it based on kind of your education, skills, experience, not just rejected because another person was more qualified? That's kind of the obvious. Of course, the person that was more qualified. Let's try and understand why. And again, doing this up front is very important because everybody's memories are fresh. If we have to go back and look at a rec that's 6, 9, 12 months old, it gets to be difficult in terms of understanding why someone was chosen or not. And this also really does go back and when you're thinking about your disposition codes and setting them up, a lot of the things that Stephanie was talking about earlier in terms of whether people want certain days, full-time, part-time shifts, those are really important disposition codes and can be the entire reason. They can be qualified for whatever reason, their education, skills, experience. They can even be more qualified than the person that was hired when you look at them for face value. But if they want, they want first shift and the only available shift is second shift, that's not going to work. So again, very important to have kind of descriptive disposition codes.
So let's talk about some common data pitfalls. And the biggest pitfall I see relates really to requisition issues. And most problems in the recruiting process and when you're looking at your recruiting and hiring data, Problems really can be avoided if you've got a good applicant tracking system that you've implemented well, and that ATS system is really capturing all the relevant information about the requisition and about the candidates applying for each requisition. Now, ideally, your requisition information should be enough that it's uniquely identifiable. So kinds of things that you want to keep about the requisition, aside from just the requisition number, you want to be able to know when that requisition was open. You want to have information about the job title, the department, the division, the supervisor. If it's for a particular shift, you want that information. If there are any particular skills and qualifications, any educational requirements, any other BFOQs, you want to be sure that that information is linked back to the requisition number. It's also important, once you make a hire, that you close out that requisition, and you want to have the date that that requisition was closed. You want to have the hire date of the successful candidate, the date that that person started, and if it's an ongoing process, which it should be, you should go back and update the requisition when that person was terminated. So ideally, you want to have everything about your requisition available and linked back to each unique number. Having good requisition information makes things a lot easier. So rather than having just the requisition number and a job title that says cashier, if you have what location, what department, what shift, what skills and experience qualifications you have, if all that stuff is right there, when you need it, you don't have to go and look for it. So get a good applicant tracking system, implement it, use it, and make sure that it captures everything about each vacancy on an ongoing basis. The other big problem are identification issues with candidates. Each candidate really should be uniquely identifiable. You want to have a unique ID number that's linked not only to each person, but to each requisition for which that person applies. And you also want to have that number linked to the employment history, to their education, to their particular skills. So really getting all the information in there about candidates with a unique identifying number is critical. And again, we've mentioned this before in the context of employee ID numbers. Don't use Social Security number as your candidate ID number. It's a really, really bad idea. You basically can use any kind of alphanumeric identifier you want, however you're comfortable, whatever number you want to start at, but just make sure that each person, each applicant has a unique identifier associated with it that allows you to link to that person's education, experience, skills, and qualifications, links back to a particular requisition. The other problem that I see frequently is when people apply, sometimes they apply for a specific vacancy, and that's a good thing. Sometimes when people apply, they apply for, quote, any job available, and that's really not a good thing. When you allow people to apply for any job available, it really can create problems, not only in your adverse impact analysis, but in the event of something happening in the hiring process, a claim of discrimination, an investigation. If you accept an application that says any job available, what that essentially means is that person becomes a candidate for any opening that you have. So if they're thinking that they want to have a customer service position, but you've got vacancies for information technology and human resources personnel, and maybe you're looking for a new chief operating officer, if that person puts any job available on the application, what that really means is they're essentially a candidate or could be a candidate for any of those vacancies you have. So it's really a good idea to make people choose specific vacancies that they're applying for and to get rid of any job available options on your application process. So you want to make sure that they focus on a specific vacancy. And just to tie back into that for specific vacancies, if somebody wants to apply for 2 jobs, let's say that there's a customer service position for the first shift and a customer service position for the second shift. If the person wants to apply for both of those, they should fill out 2 separate applications, each application going to a specific requisition number. So make sure that for each each vacancy the candidate is applying for, that you have a set of documentation. The other big problem that I sometimes see is hiring a candidate into a job for which he didn't apply. So if you've got somebody who is looking for a first shift position and you call them and you say, look, we have an opening for a second shift position, basically the same kinds of responsibilities and duties as the position you applied for. We've already filled that one, but we've got this second shift opening. Are you interested? If the candidate says yes, then again, they need to fill out a new application, create a new application record relating to the second shift requisition number. So it's important that for whatever job you hire that person into, that there's that applicant record, that all of that information for that candidate linked to that particular requisition number exists. And the other problem that I sometimes see, it's not as common, but it's something called steering issues. And what this is, I guess the best way to explain it is to put it in the context of a project that I worked on a couple of years ago. And there were 2 positions that a company was hiring for. They were hiring customer service associates that basically worked out on the floor and helped customers select products and, you know, gave them advice about the products, how to use them, those kinds of things. And they were also hiring for cashier positions. And it turned out that the men were being hired for the customer service position and the women were being hired for the cashier position. So it looks as though on the surface, on its face, that there's a discrimination problem. The men are being steered toward customer service positions and the women are being steered toward the lower paying cashier positions. But when we actually went through and looked at the hiring documentation, the applicant flow information and the interview notes, a lot of the women who ended up being hired for the cashier position originally wanted the customer service position, but then when they found out that they may have to work weekends, that there were lifting requirements involved, that the job was somewhat physically strenuous, they decided that they didn't really want that job. They would prefer the cashier position. So we were able to go back to the documentation and say, no, we didn't steer the candidates into the lower paying cashier position. Once they found out about the qualifications and requirements of the job they wanted, they changed their mind. So if the candidate changes their mind, if they request a different position during the interview phase, if something happens where they end up applying for a different job, you want to make sure that that is documented thoroughly in either the phone screen records or the interview notes. You need to make sure that that information is recorded somewhere. So the biggest pitfalls, again, surround requisition issues, candidate ID issues, and what position the person applied for versus what position they were actually considered for. So if you can keep those pieces in order, then the analysis should go pretty smoothly. Disposition codes and rejection reasons. Again, just to tie back into something Carla mentioned earlier, not selected is really not good enough. You need to know at what stage of the process the candidate was disqualified. And sometimes what we do is we do what I call a stage analysis of the hiring process. So we can look at the race or the gender mix of all applicants, and then we look at the race and gender mix of the candidates who meet the minimum qualifications, and then we look at the mix of race and gender of the people who are brought in for an in-person interview. We can look at that mix again at the stage of the second interview. So it really allows you to separate out your hiring process into different phases, and you can see if, for instance, the certain qualifications that you have for a job is disproportionately screening out females, racial minorities, older people, people with disabilities, etc. So it's really important to have those descriptive disposition codes to document how far along in the process the person got and really ultimately why each candidate was rejected. Very, very important to have.
Okay, one of the other issues that I see, and it can work perfectly fine, or it can be an issue, is having multiple hires per requisition. And, I'm not against having multiple hires per requisition. If you are hiring a customer service person at the same location with the same skill set under the same manager, everything the same, I have no problem with there being one huge applicant pool and multiple people being hired into it. Again, everything needs to be the same. You're going to hire them at around the same time. All of that needs to be the same. As soon as you change something about that, you need to create another rec. So if you're going to have different levels of customer service, customer service level 1, 2, 3, or customer service and a lead, that can't be the same requisition. So really think about when you're creating that requisition that if you're going to have multiple hires in it, they need to be exactly the same. Other problem that I have seen with this is they get into the rec, and kind of Stephanie alluded to this, was, oh, I think you'd be really great for this other job, but they just go ahead and hire you into this rec. Again, that creates a problem in terms of looking at pools and comparison. So before I move on to the next slide, there was a question that came up about kind of reposting if qualifications, job level, all of those things change. So the short answer is yes. If anything changes about the rec in terms of the location that it's in terms of any of the qualifications, if you have to be more specific or less specific, it should be reposted. And so that's very important. And how you do that technically, I can't answer that in this context. If you have more specific questions, we can talk about that kind of offline, because there's a lot of specifics about how your applicant tracking system may handle that, what to do with a specific candidate. That's a more detailed conversation. But essentially, yes, if you have something change about the rec, it really needs to be. Okay, some applicant tracking issues that we run into. The first one is basic qualifications, and this is this is really the heart of the OFCCP's Internet Applicant Regulations, basic qualifications. This really is the kind of in or out. You do get counted in your impact ratio analysis or your adverse impact analysis. If you do meet basic qualifications, if you don't, you're kind of out. So very important to have clear, concise basic qualifications for your job and to post them. So it's kind of a reminder. On an annual basis, I usually suggest retraining or reminding your recruiting staff about those Internet Applicant regulations. Some other things to think about, again, that have to do with the Internet Applicant regulations are, what are the things that you're doing other than online recruiting? So for those people that aren't coming through your applicant tracking system, are you thinking about the process too? Because the Internet Applicant regulations apply to those also. So referrals, how are you handling referrals? A lot of companies who have applicant tracking systems also have portals for referrals, or an intranet or internal way to be able to do that. How are you handling campus and job fairs? How are you getting those people into the mix and evaluating them equally to those people who come in through your applicant tracking system? Agencies, are you exclusively giving certain recs to agencies, or are you posting them and giving them to agencies? How are you treating those things? Very important. Again, also with the agencies, how are you getting your applicant tracking information? Just because you use an agency doesn't mean your responsibility is gone in terms of applicant tracking. If that has, you have to get the applicant tracking if you're handing over a rec or a hire to an agency also. Unsolicited resumes, really important. How are you handling them? And you can handle them differently from employer referrals. So unsolicited can really mean people who kind of have no connection to your company, who are giving you a resume or application outside of the process. Referrals, you could really dictate that those are from people within your company giving it to them, and you can create processes and policies to handle those separately. So those are really important pieces that a lot of people forget about. How do we handle them, and how do we code them and get them either in the system or in the report? How do we analyze them equally? And here's another big one, and again, this is kind of larger than this presentation, but it's a really good time, kind of the end of the year, to think about documentation and all the documentation that comes with doing internal and external searches. So for those of you who have applicant tracking systems and you're doing searches of your internal databases, there are documentation requirements that go along with that. And then regardless if you have an applicant tracking system or not, you maybe have access to external databases that you're doing searches for your open positions. There are tracking requirements there also. So very important, to really think about everything that's on this slide, the internet applicant tracking, and maybe putting together some reminders or some pointers for your recruiting staff to make sure you have that in order.
Now, the effects of missing data, and we've talked about this at length in the previous presentation, so I'm just going to kind of go through this pretty quickly. Bad data means a bad AAP. If you don't have good, clean, comprehensive data, you're not going to be able to produce a good, clean AAP. Having bad data, having missing data, it can lead to inaccurate conclusions. And again, your statistics are really only as good as the data that generate them. Missing data can make it look like you have an issue where you don't, and it can make you look like you're okay where you really do have an issue. So it can really mask the issues that need to be addressed. And again, clean, comprehensive data is the best way to get real knowledge about where you are and where you're going and where you need to be.
In a lot of the OFCCP conciliation agreements and big numbers and press releases that you're seeing right now are still hiring cases. So the OFCCP is still looking at your hires versus applicants, and they're still finding, discrimination in federal contractors hiring and recruitment systems, and a lot of this has to do with missing data. There's some sort of adverse impact, and there's just not the data or justification behind it. So again, it kind of shows the real importance of gathering that up front, all the things we've been talking about.
And we've talked again a lot before about the time and expense and the resources it takes to go in and fill in these data holes and to clean up the bad data. It's really a lot easier just to keep correct and comprehensive data on an ongoing basis. And this is particularly important with applicant flow, since a lot of times the information you're relying on comes from, a third-party vendor or career board or external source. And with applicant flow, oftentimes there's no history available to you. So if you don't document this on an ongoing basis and keep clean records on an ongoing basis, you may not be able to go back and recreate it, and that can be a really big problem. So aside from the time and expense and the resources, with applicant flow, it's not always possible to go back and create that history. So it's really important to get it right the first time.
Yeah, and a reminder, when you get that scheduling letter, you have 30 days to respond. And, for those of you who have been on our the other part of our series, there's a lot of data to get together. This is a big part of it. So, as accurate as you can be, it's going to save you time, and you're going to be able to focus on presenting your company in the best light possible instead of having to recreate documentation or, trying to find somewhere some kind of documentation to show what you've done. So you're really on a time crunch, and when you do that, you're just, you're kind of wasting your own internal and external resources.
And when it comes to audits and litigation issues, it's really critical to be able to recreate your applicant flow and to recreate that selection process. You want to be able to go through and identify who made it to what stage, who was compared against whom, and really recreate that whole process. And you need to recreate that process to support and defend your hiring decisions. And if you have bad data, if you have gaps in the data, you're not going to be able to recreate that process. And ultimately, that could mean that you're not able to support and defend the hiring decisions that you made.
Like I said before, the OFCCP is, hiring cases, discrimination cases are still big on their agenda, especially at, entry-level types of cases. A lot of it's because contractors out there don't have the documentation to show. So, that's where a lot of companies are having audit issues. So, okay, so some things that we're going to go through, the data scrubbing and validation. Once you think you have the clean slate of all of the people, how do you start validating and scrubbing it to make sure that you have everything that you need and it's as accurate as possible? The first thing you need to ask yourself is, do you have the right people? So first, for every hire on your hire log, once it's validated, because we've talked about the steps to make sure you have all the hires on the hire log, is there a corresponding rec filled with candidates and applicants? So that's the first check that I do when I go with my clients. I look at the hire log once I've validated that, and for every hire, I go to their applicant flow log and see if there's a corresponding rec for that hire. And I would say almost 90% of the time there's at least one missing for a number of different reasons. It could be that it was a recall. It could be that there was some sort of, one of the issues that we talked about, this person was hired into this rec or that rec. And so, again, it's really important for every hire that there is a corresponding rec in candidates and applicants. And so after you've done that validation, there still may be recs on your applicant tracking log that don't correspond to an external hire, and those may be that an internal candidate was hired, so those are really recs for promotion, and you may have both internal and external people on that. And so I don't say delete it, create another tab in your spreadsheet to move those recs to. Just like you analyze your hires versus your applicants, in the event that you find an issue within promotions, you're going to want to evaluate the promotion process the same way. So don't delete them, just move them to another tab. Try and keep your applicant flow tab clean for external hires and the corresponding applicants. And then another question is, are both internal and external applicants included? So sometimes I start to see, if I'm looking at the recs and I see only external people, there's no internal people applying for those jobs, but I talk with the client and I say, for this type of job, 50% of the time we promote from within, 50% of the time we look externally. So if I start to see, a series of recs or a lot of recs that don't have anybody internally that has applied for the job, then I start to say, was there an issue with pulling the report that you didn't, put the internal applicants on there also? So, if the person was hired, if the person that was in the rec was hired externally, even if there are internal applicants for that rec, keep those on also. Those are a few. The next is, okay, now we know we have all the right people. For every rec for every hire, we have a rec. We've taken off the promo rec, and then we've made sure everybody's included that needs to be. And so now we look at, once that's validated, do we have the right code? So then we look at by job title, kind of that by the rec job title should have a corresponding title on the hire log, and then you just make sure that by job title you have the right EEO and AA job group codes the same as you have on the hire log. Also, you're going to look for any missing data. So are you have any missing sources or disposition codes, and then follow up with whomever you need to on that for any missing data that you have. For those of you who kind of use data management techniques under the Internet Applicant regulations, one of the things that I do to see if the people who are doing the recruiting and staffing have used that correctly is I sort that rec by application date. So if they're using a data management technique and that rec has 300 people in it, and they use a data management technique, I sort it by date of application. And if I see the disposition code of data management technique just all the way, kind of sparse throughout the rec here and there, then I know that that hasn't been used correctly. The way that I see if it's used correctly is if I sort it by date of application and I see the bottom half of it all have the data management technique, then I know that they've used that correctly in that they've said, okay, this first set of 10, the second set of 10, this third set of 10, and then everybody after a certain date has that code. So that's a way for me to be able to give feedback back to my clients on using that data management technique. I also analyze the last two steps in disposition codes. So a few things that I kind of ask myself when I'm looking at the recs are, how many people were interviewed per rec? You know, am I starting to see that there's no one other than the hire that was interviewed? And that kind of seems like that may not be possible, so I'll ask the question of the client. It may just mean that the last selection step wasn't updated in the system. How many people met basic qualifications? If I start to see a very entry-level job and there's only a couple people who meet basic qualifications, then I know that it may be a misunderstanding of that recruiter or whoever's entering that information of really understanding how to identify basic qualifications and how to evaluate and disposition. And then are there any recs with no comparator applicants? My clients, you know, already know that if there's a rec sent to me and there's only one person in it, that there's some that they typically send an explanation as to why that is. So those are some of the questions that I start asking myself and start putting comments in when I'm evaluating data of my clients, and send to them to get justification. So regardless of whether you're working with a consultant or you're doing it internally, those are some of the questions that you should be asking to make sure you have the right people and the right code.
And in addition to having the right people and the right codes, it's important to look at whether or not you're consistent. And specifically with applicant flow, you want to have a consistent use of screening techniques, educational requirements, and skill requirements. You know, if you're posting a vacancy for a customer service associate 1 and you list, you know, high school education required, basic math skills required, and then you post another vacancy for that same job 6 months later, are the educational requirements and skill requirements the same? Are they different? If they're different, why have they changed? What did you learn about that position that led you to change those requirements? And you need to have all that stuff documented. I also look for consistent use of disposition codes. So again, we really want to avoid that not selected disposition code. We really want to have a detailed description of how far along in the process the person got and what that ultimate step was. So are we using our disposition codes consistently? Are we using them appropriately? Are we consistently documenting at each stage of the recruiting and hiring process? So are we documenting the pre-employment screening tests? Are we keeping the same documentation about credit checks and background checks? Are we doing the same thing in terms of documentation, not only at each stage in the recruiting process, but for each vacancy, for each requisition, and for each candidate? Are we treating each application and each candidate consistently? You know, are we using a same shelf life measure for an application if somebody sends it in? Are we considering an application for related positions? If we are, then we need to consider everybody for those related positions. If we're not, then we shouldn't consider anybody for related positions. And that sort of ties back into what I was saying earlier about if people are applying for multiple jobs, you want to make them fill out multiple applications for multiple requisition numbers. So we want to have consistent treatment of each application in terms of shelf life, related positions that that person might be considered for, and we want to make sure that we're consistently treating each candidate. Are we giving them the same screening tests? Are we imposing the same kinds of restrictions on education and background and qualification? Are those consistent across different vacancies for the same job? We also want to look at where our gaps are in our data. And as I've said before, looking at the gaps really can help you identify shortcomings in your processes and your procedures. You want to look for those random one-off gaps versus systemic gaps. One thing to look for is, are there certain kinds of candidates that are missing the same kinds of information? So if you get 20% of the candidates for a particular vacancy from one reference source, from an employment agency, are all those candidates missing the same pieces of information? If they are, then you need to go back to that third party, that recruiting source, and say, look, these are the pieces of information that we need. You're not providing us with X, Y, and Z. We need to be sure that that's filled in. So identifying where the candidates come from vis-a-vis what information they're missing may precipitate a conversation with that source of applicant. It's also important to look at whether or not there are gaps in your policies and procedures. And really figuring out where the gaps are right now can prevent future issues. And again, with applicant flow, it's really difficult to create that history. So you need to make sure that everything is correct now. It's very difficult to go back and fill in those gaps and make corrections in the future. So look at your policies and procedures, look at where your data gaps are, figure out where those gaps are and what you can do to fix them now and to prevent them from occurring in the future. And when it comes to data scrubbing and validation, it's really an interactive process. And Carla and I both go back and forth with our clients and ask questions, and we want you to know that you should be prepared to receive those questions when we have issues with the data. A couple of things that I look for that I'll go back and forth with the client on. If I see unusual variations in pool size among similar vacancies, so if customer service associate 1 typically has 200 people in the pool and you send me a data file for a particular requisition for that same job and there's only 2 people in the pool, that's a red flag that there may be something going on. We also look for candidates that are hired without an associated requisition numbers with no hires, the same kinds of things that Carla talked about in terms of do we have the right people and do we have the right codes. And it really is an interactive process. Our job as consultants is to help you clean up that data, to get that data in the best possible form so you can have a good analysis, you can have a good AAP, and really understand where your issues are, where you're doing well, and what kinds of things you need to work on.
And I would say about a third of my questions to clients, and I send it by email or do conference calls, whichever the client prefers, about a third of my questions are about applicant tracking. So kind of like we've said in the past, be ready for those questions, especially if you're new to federal contracting, if you're new to an applicant tracking system. There's so much that you can do to analyze the data. And then there's a lot of suggestions that we can make to help better your process. So kind of getting in that mindset of these questions are really going to help me find my gaps and make the process better.
And I like to think of applicant flow as really the beginning of the entire employment process. It's really how people get into your organization. Everything that happens with hiring, promotion, termination, compensation, all of those things really stem from applicant flow because that's where your employees begin. So applicant flow is the first stage in the process, and if you can get the applicant flow right, if you can capture the information that you need to capture, if you can defend your selections, if you have a good working applicant tracking system, if you get applicant flow right, it makes it easier to get everything else later on in the process right. Your hiring, your promotions, your terminations, all of those things will work more smoothly if you have the strong foundation of the applicant flow information, because applicant flow really is how people get into your organization.
In discrimination and hiring practice, it's always going to be a focus of the OFCCP, especially for entry-level jobs. And so, you need to review it before the OFCCP does it. Really create procedures, document fully every step of the process, analyze it, do it before the OFCCP does it, because once that scheduling letter comes in, you're in the middle of an audit, it's hard to get, like we talked about, hard to get all of this done in the 30 days. So this is the final slide. If there are any questions that anybody has, feel free to contact either of us. This has our email addresses, our phone numbers, website. Each website has, newsletters on it, articles. Stephanie has a lot of ebooks and a lot of white papers. So they're really great resources for additional information, along with the archived webinars that we've done. So if any of you have missed the previous webinars, those archived webinars are on both the websites. Just want to thank everybody for attending, and hope you have a good rest of the afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.